The Ramo, Rav Moshe Isserles, in Torah Sa'olam, relates that the great Greek philosopher Plato came to Yerushalayim immediately after the Chum, immediately after the destruction of the temple, and he found Yirmiyahu Hanavi, the prophet Jeremiah, crying broken-heartedly over the destruction of the temple. And Plato said to Yirmiyahu, I have two questions to ask you. He says, the first is, if you're such a chacham, if you're so clever, why are you crying over stones and wood? And the second is, it's not seemly that you're weeping over something from the past. Yirmiyahu Hanavi looked at him and he said, if you have any questions, I'll answer them. He said to him, as a philosopher, you must have many philosophical enigmas that have yet to be resolved. And Plato said, indeed I do. He says, I have many questions, but I believe that no one in the world is capable of answering them. Tell me your questions, said Yirmiyahu, and I'll try to answer them. And with a great deal of skepticism, Plato related his questions, and to his astonishment, Yirmiyahu resolved them all. Stunned at that spectacular display of transcendent wisdom, Plato could hardly believe that he was talking to a human being, flesh and blood. And Yirmiyahu told him, all of this wisdom, everything that you've just been privy to, I drew from the stones and the wood that you made so much fun of. He thinks that us today probably have more in common with Plato than with Yirmiyahu. Perhaps an inability to understand what it is that the temple means, what it is that the temple gave us. Maharal, at the end of Masechta Tainis, the Maharal writes that the first Beis Hamikdash was greater than the second because the Galus was longer. The first Beis Hamikdash, Galus of Mitzrayim, was 400 years. Second Beis Hamikdash, the Galus Bava, was 70 years. Imagine what the third Beis Hamikdash is supposed to be. Imagine what it will look like after 2,000 years of Galus. Do we understand? Do we recognize? Can we even begin to comprehend what it means not to have the temple? Rav Gershon Mikitov, when he first came to Eretz Yisrael from Russia, he was amazed to see what Yerushalayim looked like. After so many years of saying kinnos, of sitting on the floor, and of weeping the destruction of the temple on Tisha B'Av, Gershon Mikitov thought that he was going to come to a city that was destroyed with piles of smoking rubble everywhere. And yet he found Arab families living in their homes, running their businesses, living their lives normally. completely unaware of the terrible devastation that had occurred. And he then applied the pasuk from Slichus, which says, I recall Hashem, and my heart pines when I see each city built in its place. A reference to the Yerushalayim Shel Mata, to this physical Yerushalayim that we live in, and the city of Hashem, which is a reference to Yerushalayim Shel Mala, the Yerushalayim that HaKadosh Baruch Hu resides in, cast down to its depths. I don't even know it's possible for us to understand what it means to have a Beis HaMikdash, to have a temple. But before we can even begin to try to understand, we need to begin to understand and to recognize what it means not to have a Beis HaMikdash. Pri Megadim writes that the true tragedy of the Churban is that it can only be seen in the Shemayim. We hear again, like last year, like the year before, we sit on the floor, we recite the Kinnos, we wish that Tisha B'Av would be a Yom Tov, and yet we don't really understand, we don't really realize what it is that we need. The Alter Tzanzer Rebbe, Zecher Tzadik Livrocha, used to point out, Chazal teach that the fetus, when it's in the womb, sees everything from one end of the world to the other, misofa olam ad sofa. Everything. Then he would ask, where is this wonderful vision? Where did it go? How come it disappears when the child is born? And he explained that when the child is born, Chazal teach that a malach taps it on its lips and he forgets his Torah. And since his Torah is gone, his vision ceases. He can no longer see. Misofa olam at soifoi, because without the Torah, there is no vision. How can it be that a nation can be persecuted by almost every other nation in the world? How can it be that a nation can be looked down upon by everybody else? Pasuk says in Yirmiyahu, Va'at shadud ma ta'asi. But you, O persecuted one, ma ta'asi, what can you do? Ki tilbashi shoni, ki sa'adi adi zov, ki tikri'i befuch inayich, lashov tisyanvi. You can wear crimson garments, you can adorn yourself with golden ornaments, you can put on makeup and enlarge your eyes, but you'll have beautified yourself for no reason. Mosu boch oigvim nafshech yivakshu. Because the despoilers, they despise you and they seek your very life. Explains the Beis HaLevi. There are two forms of hatred. There's someone who hates somebody else because he can't stand the way that he looks. He's dirty. He's bedraggled. Says the Beis HaLevi, that's easy enough to deal with. Just give him a bath, give him some clean clothing, and the problem is taken care of. But, says the Beis Halevi, there's a different kind of hatred which is much more insidious when the person himself is the cause of the hatred. It doesn't matter what they look like. It doesn't matter how clean they are. The very sight of the person is enough to make the person sick. We, the Jewish people, we're persecuted. We're persecuted without end. And we, the Jewish people, imagine that if we would just excel at what the non-Jewish nations admire, then we'll be accepted and we'll be respected. The Navi Yirmiyahu was teaching that nothing could be further from the truth. The other nations of the world, they don't hate us because we're dirty. They don't hate us because we're smelly, because we're unkempt. They hate us because we are HaKadosh Baruch Hu's chosen people. And yet we choose not to act as if we're HaKadosh Baruch Hu's chosen people. Rav Pam, Zeichet Tzadik Livrocha, points out that in Sefer Shoftim there's a phrase which appears on a couple of occasions. The Navi uses the expression, Bayamim Ahem, Ein Melech B'Yisrael, Ish Ayosha Be'inov Yaseh. That in the time of the Shoftim there was no king. Everybody did whatever the right thing to do was. The last time that pasuk appears is at the end of Sefer Shoftim, towards the end of Sefer Shoftim. Rav Pam points out that the end of Sefer Shoftim is a terrible, horrible period in Jewish history. Tragic events, idolatry, immorality, bloodshed that took place within the Jewish nation. We were destroying ourselves. And how does Shoftim end? It ends with the words, Bayamim Ahem ein melech b'Yisrael ish hayosha be'enov yaseh. Everybody does whatever he wants to do, even though everybody was doing what they shouldn't have been doing. Says Rav Pam, how can it be? How can it be that the same pasuk is used earlier on in Sefer Shoftim, and it's used at the end of Sefer Shoftim when everything is going wrong, everything's beginning to unravel? And he explains, because at that time in history, everyone was doing what they wanted to do, as if nothing had transpired during that entire horrendous period. Everybody just kept doing what they wanted to do without learning any of the lessons that had taken place throughout that whole period of time. Rabbi say, it happened then, and it's happening now. We imagine that for some reason which is beyond our control, we're commemorating another Tisha B'Av. We imagine that the state that we're in right now has nothing to do with us. And yet, Bayamim Ahem, Ein Melech B'Yisrael, Ish Ayosha Be'enov Yaseh. We carry on doing exactly what we want to do, imagining that we'll be able to get away with it, imagining that we don't have to learn from history. Chassam Sofer points out the fasts that we're commemorating begin with Asara B'Teves. On the 10th of Teves, back in the winter, that's when the siege was laid down on Yerushalayim. On the 17th of Tammuz, 2.5 years later, the walls were breached. And 3 weeks later, on Tisha B'Av, the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed. The Chassam Sofer points out there's a unique dimension to Asara B'Teves, to that first fast, something which doesn't exist by any of the others. He cites the Avud Raham. The Avud Raham rules that if Asara B'Teves would fall on Shabbos, we would have to fast. Hillel II, when he created the calendar that we have, made sure that Asara B'Teves would not fall out on Shabbos. But that's just a technical issue. All the other fasts that we have, if they fall out on Shabbos, so we push them off. They get moved. There are two fasts, Kivayochel. The first is Yom Kippur, which when it falls on Shabbos, that's when we fast, what will be this year in Mitzvah Hashem. And the second one is Asara B'Teves. If there would have been a possibility for Asara B'Teves to land on Shabbos, we would have to fast. Why is that? They learned it from a pasuk. The pasuk in Yechezkel, which talks about Asara B'Teves, uses the phrase Be'etzem Hayom Hazeh. Be'etzem Hayom Hazeh is the same lashon that's used to describe Yom Kippur. So from there, the Avud Raham learns that the same way that we fast on Shabbos for Yom Kippur, we have to fast on Asara B'Teves if it falls out on Shabbos as well. Beis Yosef doesn't accept the Avud Raham, he doesn't discount it entirely. The Chassam Sofer explains like this. On the year that the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, on Tisha B'Av, the decree that it would be destroyed was on Asara B'Teves. That divine psak, that divine ruling that the temple would be destroyed was put into place on Asara B'Teves, way before the destruction. And the Chassam Sofer adds an incredible chiddush. He says every year, whether or not we will have to commemorate Tisha B'Av as a fast, is decreed on Asara B'Teves as well. Each year is a new year. Each year is its own creation. And each year requires its own decree to stop Tisha B'Av from being a fast day. And that decree is decreed on Asara B'Teves, and he explains the uniqueness. The uniqueness of Asara B'Teves. Every other fast that we're fasting, we're commemorating something which happened in the past. A fast which commemorates something in the past doesn't override Shabbos. That has to be pushed off. But because Asara B'Teves determines what will be in the future, says the Chassam Sofer, that means that theoretically we would have to fast on Shabbos if it were to fall out on Shabbos. I think that most of us make the mistake of imagining that we're here today because we didn't treat Tisha B'Av with enough seriousness. We're here today because the 3 weeks, we didn't treat them in the way that we were supposed to treat them. The Chassam Sofer is saying not like that. In order to undo Tisha B'Av, in order to undo the 3 weeks, we have to begin with Asara B'Tevis. We have to begin the process of tshuva, the process of recognizing that we need HaKadosh Baruch Hu has to begin way back in the winter. How do you do that? How can we reach that point? By knowing that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is always with us. In the hardest of times, in the best of times, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is there together with us, always. In the Haftarah that was read, Shabbos Chazon, the Shabbos before Tisha B'Av, the Navi Yirmiyahu says, Koy Amar Hashem. This is what HaKadosh Baruch Hu says. Zachati lo chesed nu'urayich, avas kloisayich, lechteich acharai b'midbar be'eretz lo yizruah. That HaKadosh Baruch Hu is promising us that He will always be with us. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is telling us that He's with us. It's not a question of whether HaKadosh Baruch Hu is here or not, it's a question of whether we see whether HaKadosh Baruch Hu is here or not. It's not a question of my trying to draw HaKadosh Baruch Hu closer to me. It's a question of my being able to recognize that I have to work on myself in order to see that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is there. All HaKadosh Baruch Hu is waiting for is for us to reconnect to Him. All He wants is for us to come towards Him, and He'll take care of everything else. But we have to recognize that He's there. If we don't recognize, if we don't work on ourselves, if we don't try to pull away the things that are blinding us, then Rahman al-Itzlan will be back here next year as well to listen to the same things all over again. I heard the most incredible story. In the darkest years, the Holocaust, 2 Talmidim from Yeshivas Telz were on the run, trying to stay one step ahead of the Nazis, Yemach Shmam v'Zichram. They were forced into hiding, the Nazis were everywhere. And these 2 Talmidei Chachamim were crouched in an underground hole. And they heard above them the pounding footsteps of the Nazis searching for Jews all over the place. And as their ominous sounds of their boots filled the small space that they were in, one of those Bochrim, Rav Chaim Stein, turned to his friend, Rav Meir Zeligman, and he told him, "You're musical. Quick, compose a niggun, make a tune to the verse from Yeshayahu, Ma novu ale orim, raglei mevaseh, mashmiya sholoi mevaseh tov mashmiya Yeshua." How pleasant are the footsteps of the herald upon the mountains announcing peace, heralding good tidings, announcing salvation. Rav Chaim Stein heard in their hate-filled, threatening footsteps, he heard a posuk, a verse describing the footsteps of the Geula, the footsteps of the redemption. Chaim Stein is teaching all of us. Everything is only dependent on how we look at it. We can see HaKadosh Baruch Hu within everything. We can see HaKadosh Baruch Hu everywhere. But only if we're prepared to do it. It's an amazing Zohar. The Zohar Kodesh says that there are shasar organs in the body, 365 organs in the body. Chazal say they correspond to the 365 days of the year. Every day in the year corresponds to one of the organs in our body. Says the Zohar Kodesh, Tisha B'Av corresponds to the Gid HaNoshe, the sciatic nerve. What's special about the Gid HaNoshe? First of all, we're not allowed to eat it. But we're not allowed to eat it because of what took place. Yaakov Avinu was left by himself wrestling for his life against what he thought was a person but was really a malach, it was really an angel. And when the malach realized that he wasn't able to kill Yaakov Avinu, he hit him on his Gid HaNoshe, dislocated his hip. Says the Zohar Kodesh, Tisha B'Av is the day that corresponds to the Gid HaNoshe. Rizal explains that in the same way that malach, which was the Sorah Shel Esav, the malach Hamoves, the Yetzer Hara, tried to kill Yaakov, but ended up only being able to harm the Gid HaNoshe, so too our enemies can try to destroy us, but they'll only have success on Tisha B'Av to a certain degree. According to the Sifrei Kabbalah, a person who eats on Tisha B'Av is like somebody who ate the Gid HaNoshe. Because a person who eats on Tisha B'Av, of course we're not talking about somebody who has to eat for medical reasons. But a person who eats on Tisha B'Av is denouncing the fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is guarding over him. He's denouncing the fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is looking out for him, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is everywhere. And he's like somebody who ate from the Gid HaNoshe. The Sefer HaChinuch writes that the mitzvah of Gid HaNoshe is a reminder of the battle against the Yetzer Hara, the battle of the Sorah Shel Esav. How could it be that Yaakov Avinu was victorious? Because HaKadosh Baruch Hu was together with him. When we know that Hashem is with us, when we live our lives with the knowledge that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is there together with us at all times and in all ways, then it's not possible for us to be defeated. It's a battle in every generation. A battle for every person within every generation. But the lesson is that however bleak things look, we will be victorious. That's the connection between the Gid HaNoshe and Tisha B'Av. We will overcome. Most amazing detail. The only tefillah found in the whole of Sefer HaChinuch is over here together with the Gid HaNoshe, where the Sefer HaChinuch writes that in the same way that Yaakov Avinu was zeicher to have the Shemesh heal him, the sun should heal him, so too we will be zeicher to Shimshei Shel Mashiach, that the Shemesh of the Mashiach will heal us as well. Sefer HaChinuch is not a sefer of tefillas. Sefer HaChinuch is not a sefer of skulas. Sefer HaChinuch is coming to explain the mitzvahs. And yet, when it comes to the mitzvah of Gid HaNoshe, the Sefer HaChinuch feels a chiyuv to give us a tefillah that we should experience what it means to be healed by the Mashiach. Psiksa De'echa, one of the Midrashim, Megillas Eicha says that after the Churban, the Ribono Shel Olam instructed Yirmiyahu Hanavi to summon Avram Avinu, Yitzchok Avinu, Yaakov Avinu, and Moshe Rabbeinu. Says the Lashon in the Medrash, because they know how to cry. The Medrash then describes at great length how Avram Avinu went to plead on behalf of his descendants, asking HaKadosh Baruch Hu why they were being driven out of their land, why were we being handed over to the foreign nations, why were we being killed in cruel and unusual ways. He asked why the Beis Hamikdash was being destroyed. The Beis Hamikdash, the place Avram Avinu points out that he brought Yitzchok Avinu to the Akedah for. He brought him there like an oiler, and the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed. Why? Says Avram Avinu to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Why? And the Medrash relates that HaKadosh Baruch Hu answers that the Jewish people have sinned by violating the Torah, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu called the Torah as a witness to back up his words, to prove his point to Avram Avinu. And Avram Avinu challenges the testimony of the Torah. Avram Avinu says to the Torah, Biti, my daughter, are you not ashamed before me? Do you remember the day that HaKadosh Baruch Hu brought you to all the other nations of the world? And no one wanted to accept you until my children stood at Har Sinai and said, Na'aseh v'nishma. They took you. They honored you. And now, in their time of trouble, you've come to testify against them? The Medrash then describes the most astonishing thing. That the Torah, Kiviyachol, stood off to one side, unwilling to testify against the Jewish nation. And the Medrash goes on at great length, detailing how Avram Avinu successfully challenged the various letters within the Aleph base, preventing them from coming to testify against the Jewish people. And then Avram Avinu says to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Ribono Shel Olam, I was 100 years old when you gave me a son. And when that son was 37 years old, you told me, bring him up as an oiler before me. I didn't show any mercy. Says Avram Avinu, I bound him myself. I was ready to do exactly what you told me to do. Will you not remember this and have mercy on my children? But Hashem did not answer. And then Yitzchok Avinu recalled in front of God how he willingly stretched out his neck for slaughter at the Akedah, pleading that in the merit of his being prepared to give up his life to do what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu should have mercy. But Hashem did not answer. And then Yaakov Avinu stepped forward. And he spoke about the 20 years of mistreatment that he had at the hands of Lauffer. How he was moiser nefesh to protect his children when Esav tried to annihilate them. The many, many years of Tsar Gidl Bonim, of problems and difficulties that he had to try to bring up his children. And he pleaded that HaKadosh Baruch Hu should have mercy from everything that Yaakov had sacrificed in order to bring the Jewish nation into the world. But Hashem did not answer. And then Moshe Rabbeinu said to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, started to describe the unparalleled Mesiras Nefesh, self-sacrifice of leading the Jewish people through the desert. And he pleaded with HaKadosh Baruch Hu at length. And he tried like this, and he tried like that, and he mentioned this, and he mentioned that, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu did not answer. And then the Medrash relates that out of nowhere, Rachel Imeinu sprang forwards, and she recalled the time that she gave the signs to her sister Leah to allow Leah to marry Yaakov Avinu instead of her. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu turned to Rachel Imeinu and he said, restrain your voice from weeping. Stop crying, because there's reward for your accomplishments. There's hope for the future. Ask Rav Pinkus, very simple question. What was it that Rachel Imeinu achieved that the others hadn't achieved? What was it that Rachel Imeinu said that made HaKadosh Baruch Hu react and let Rachel Imeinu know that there's hope for the future? And explains Rav Pinkus the most incredible explanation. He says, if somebody would have asked Avram Avinu, why were you willing to sacrifice your life at all custom to be thrown into the fiery furnace? He would have answered, what kind of question is that? I'm being moiser nefesh because of my emunah in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because I believe in Hashem. Says Rav Pinkus, if you would have asked Yitzchak Avinu, why are you stretching your neck out on the Mizbeach to be offered up as an oiler? He would have replied, what kind of question is that? Because HaKadosh Baruch Hu told me to do it. If you would have asked Yaakov Avinu, why did he work so hard in Beis Lavan, in the house of Lavan, where he worked for 7 years in order to marry Rachel, and then another 7 years in order to marry Rachel because he was given Leah instead? Where Yaakov Avinu is made, he testifies that he didn't go to sleep for a whole night over there. He was in the hot and the cold, and he was working all the time. If somebody would have said to him, why? Why did you do that? Yaakov Avinu would have said, what kind of question is that? I was busy building Klal Yisrael. But if somebody would have come to Rachel Imeinu and they would have said to her, what are you being mevater over here? What are you giving up? You're going to give up on marrying Yaakov Avinu? She didn't know that she was going to end up marrying him. You're going to give up marrying this incredible tzaddik? You're going to give up being the mother to the saintly Shvatim? You're going to give up on building Klal Yisrael for what? Why are you doing this? Did HaKadosh Baruch Hu command you to do this? But Pinkus says that Rachel Imenu will answer, no. HaKadosh Baruch Hu didn't tell me to do this. I'm doing this so that my sister will not be embarrassed. The Piechesner Rebbe, Shed Bimkom Domoi, writes in the name of his father, the Rebbe of Grodzitsk, that being Moise Nefesh for another Jew is even greater than being Moise Nefesh for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Why? Because he says it's like somebody who shows his love for the king that he's prepared to give up his life to help the crown prince. We cannot fathom the greatness of the Jews through the ages, up to and including our generation, who give up their lives al Kiddush Hashem while crying out Shema Yisrael. But at the time of their Mesiras Nefesh, at the time that they were giving up their lives, they had no doubt that they were doing what HaKadosh Baruch Hu commanded them to do. Even greater is the example of Rachel Imenu, sacrificing not for an explicit command from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but simply so that her sister won't be embarrassed. All of us like to think of ourselves as being ready and willing and able to jump into the fiery flames, shouting Shema Yisrael. But during these days, we must strive to develop and exhibit some Mesiras Nefesh when it comes to our fellow man. To understand that Mesiras Nefesh is even greater than being Moise Nefesh to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. There was a great French novelist, not Jewish, the 19th century, probably perhaps the greatest of all the French novelists, somebody called Marcel Proust. And he wrote that the real voyage of discovery consists not in seeking new landscapes, but in having new eyes. That's what this period of time is all about. To learn how to look at the world differently. To learn how to see things differently from the way that we've seen up until now. There is an astonishing story. It's a story which almost defies comprehension. One man's ability to refuse to be consumed by hatred. Maybe 20 years ago, during visiting day in a camp in America, a father went to visit his daughter and he brought his father with him. He should be able to visit his granddaughter. And they're walking down one of the paths in the camp, and an elderly man walked in the other direction towards them. They crossed paths. And the two older men nodded hello to each other and kept walking. Son had never seen this person before. He had no idea who he was. So he asked his father, "Who is he?" So his father told him, before the war, growing up in Sapna, that man was my best friend and my chavrusa of many years. The son was a little taken aback because he'd never seen this man before. So he asked his father, tell me, Tati, if he was your best friend and if he was your chavrusa, how come it was enough just to nod hello? Why didn't you speak with him? And his father told him like this. Before the war, I succeeded in procuring exit visas for myself, for my wife, and for my children. The time hadn't yet come to be able to use them, so I hid them. I didn't tell anybody the hiding place, not my parents, not my siblings. There was only one person in the world who knew where they were hidden. And that was my best friend. When the time came to take those exit visas out from their hiding place, they weren't there. My best friend had taken those visas. And with those visas, he saved himself and he saved his family, whilst I lost my wife and my children. Son looked at his father and he says, Tati, he says, how come you didn't go over to him? How come you didn't scream at him? How come you didn't shout at him? How come you just nodded hello and kept walking? And his father answered, those were different times. I should never have put him into that nisayon to begin with. That response is almost beyond the ability of all but the greatest of the tzaddikim among us to conceive. We flare in anger at others without making the slightest effort to perceive the situation from their point. We nurture grudges for the smallest slights for years. And here was a victim capable of understanding the desperation and the fear that drove his closest friend to act in a way that resulted indirectly but foreseeably in the deaths of his wife and of his children. Rabbi Tzadok Milublin, in Tzidkas HaTzadik writes, Keshem shetzorich odom lamin b'Hashem, in the same way that a person has an obligation to believe in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, kach achar kach lamin ba'atzmoi. Afterwards he has to learn how to believe in himself. Only a person who believes in himself is capable of being moise nefesh, not just for HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but for all the others around him as well. Yiratzoin, shenizkeh kulanu biyachad, to see the world with new eyes, to believe in ourselves to the point that we're able to relate to those around us differently to how we have up until now. And by doing so, we will all join together to walk down the road just outside of the yeshiva to meet the Melech HaMashiach and to rejoice together with the whole of Klal Yisrael in the rebuilt Beis HaMikdash. Amen. Amen.